Hello, Dickinson community. This is Dr. Rebecca Shoemaker, one of the staff psychologists here at the Wellness Center. Today, I want to share a presentation with you about some of my favorite forms of self-care and coping. These are practices that I've used for many, many years, predating the pandemic, but through the pandemic, I've found that they take on even more significance. And so because self-care can be so broad and in some ways a little bit daunting when we talk with students about how to take care of yourself, how to prioritize your health, positive forms of coping as opposed to more maladaptive forms. I think it's really nice to give them a window into how we may practice self-care and coping. So I'm really excited to share a few PowerPoint slides with you and kind of walk you through not only the content on them, but how they play out in my life in terms of self-care practice and healthy coping. All right. And just as a reminder, coping skills and self-care are really individualized. What works for me, the things that I find helpful and energizing may or may not fit with everyone watching this presentation. So this is just a window into what helps me to calm down or to relax or fill a gap in my understanding of something to help me deal with difficult times or times of uncertainty. So I think from a very young age, gaining knowledge to better understand something was my approach to calming down or relieving anxiety. If I could understand it a little bit more, I could answer those questions that were swirling around in my head a bit better. And so when TED Talks became a thing, I can't even remember how many years ago that was, I really gravitated to this as a form of self-care and coping, not just from a professional standpoint. As you'll see from many of these, there is some social justice or professional content to them, but I think it also provided a way to connect with new ideas, new ways of innovating across the world that in some way, seemed very exhilarating to me to bring in new ideas, to better understand things that I didn't know. And for the students that I've worked with, or if you've heard me speak in any other outreaches, I certainly talk about identifying as a TED Talk geek in a lot of ways that I really enjoy what TED Talks have to offer me. So I want to share just a little bit of information about the ones that you're seeing here on screen. The first two you'll see are by Brene Brown, which as we go through this presentation, you'll get to know her name and her work pretty well. She's certainly a researcher that I value very much in the mental health field, but also in her social justice work, as well as just the way that she talks about human relationships. And so in these two TED Talks, she unpacks her research and her personal experiences with vulnerability, with understanding shame and what it takes for us to create trusting relationships that we can feel connected, that we feel like we belong. And in my work with college students over the last several years, I would say loneliness and not feeling like they belong to a group or to a certain family even. Those are issues that come up with a lot of students that I work with here and at other campuses. And these are two TED Talks that I often recommend students watch, particularly when they have some time to self-reflect, take some time alone to watch them. I think not only for enjoyment, because Brene Brown has a great presentation style. She tells personal stories and narratives so well. You really feel like you connect with her. But I think the more you watch them, a second viewing or a third even, the content becomes much deeper. And I think you take a little bit more away from them because you engage with the content differently. In a way, you're learning to become more vulnerable each time you watch them, and you think about what parts of your life may resonate with the striving for perfectionism, and much of that being to avoid shame and blame and judgment from others. So I really love those two talks in particular. The third TED Talk is a very moving presentation by the mother of one of the Columbine shooters. And I think this talk offers two things for myself and for other students, watchers of all kinds. And the first is a lesson of sorts in human compassion and empathy, things that I feel are in very short supply. If you look at this country more broadly right now, where we are socially and politically, we're really struggling to be compassionate towards others and to ourselves. So I think hearing her story, watching her share how she's come to reevaluate herself and her relationship with her son, since this mass tragedy, is really impactful, and also serves as a good reminder that we don't always have all pieces of the story, and that, rather than quickly jumping to criticize or judge someone based on someone else's actions that they're associated with, taking the time to find space to hear, to listen. I think that's such a powerful message that we all need to be hearing and taking in right now. The other message that I really love about this TED Talk is it serves as a great medium for talking about mental health and suicide prevention. And I think, the more this woman began to understand the depths of her son's mental health struggles and his struggle with suicidal thinking and planning, and ultimately engaging in murder-suicide violent acts, it highlighted, that there's so much that that may have been missed, while at the same time acknowledging that we as individuals cannot own the feelings and behaviors of everyone around us. We can do our best to be vigilant, to be present in relationships, to show up and connect and be vulnerable as best we can, and to encourage those that we see struggling to get professional help and to look for those signs. But we don't have the ability to control what people do in that sense. Even from a mother's perspective, she really grapples with what she missed and talks about, well, why didn't I know and why didn't I see these things? So it's also a really good moment of just human connection, I think, and really speaking to the need for better mental health services in this country, and more access to good professional mental health services as well. The next one is a fun yet thought-provoking TED Talk about finding the courage to come out of the closet. And in this case, closets does have the connotation with sexual identity, gender identity, but it extends beyond that in the talk, that we all struggle with our own closets. Things about our lives, about our identity, our experiences that that we hide away from others, and often cause us great shame and pain. And because of that, not only do we miss out on connecting with others, but other people miss out on being part of our lives and sharing experiences with us. And so I like this talk because it really opens up dialogue for what courage to come out of the closet, whatever that pain may be, whatever that fear may be, to really step away from comparing suffering, comparing one's closet to another, and just accepting that we all as humans have pain. We are all suffering with something, and what courage it really takes for us to validate that for ourselves and for each other, and to step into our own authenticity, rather than saying my pain is worse than somebody else's, or somebody else's pain is worse than mine. We all have our closets, but I love how this presenter hits home with the point that a closet is no place for a human being to live. So I thought that was a really insightful talk there. The next one focuses on how we understand stories and personal narrative, and the real danger that follows from conceptualizing a person or a group of people from a single story, the inherent biases and stereotypes that follow from that single story narrative, and why that's so damaging on a personal level, but also on a more global level. And this presenter talks about what it was like to be the victim of a single story narrative or stereotype, but also how she unknowingly recreated that single story narrative for others in her life, based on cultural influences, based on family norms. And so I think I included it here because, again, it challenges us to step outside of a single story or a single thought about the person in front of us, or the group that we're interacting with, and to really get to know those individuals for who they are, and their unique identities, rather than creating a single script that could be very damaging to those individuals and to those groups from a social justice perspective. The next one is a TED Talk that I began using when I was teaching during my doc program. I taught a course on mindfulness and counseling, and I used this video to kind of play around with the idea of the impact of US society and culture staying so busy to the point that not only are we exhausted and kind of tuned out and zoned out most of the time, but we're missing present moment connections. We're missing opportunities to be still and calm, to be reflective. And ultimately that translates into increased stress, to anxiety, to frustration, to conflict in relationships. And we're here for such a short time as human beings. And this is a playful way of thinking about, how do we want to exist in a lot of ways? And what do we maybe miss when we're so busy that all we think about is what's next, rather than simply being in the present? And lastly, I included a talk by Temple Grandin, The World Needs All Kinds of Minds. She really became such an advocate for the autism spectrum movement and neurodiversity, and helping us understand the value of all kinds of different ways of thinking, that along the autism spectrum, you have people with unique ways of thinking, of perceiving the world differently, which means that they're uniquely set for solving different problems, for understanding problems that we face in this world differently, and therefore coming up with unique solutions that sometimes those who are very much verbally inclined, in terms of their cognitive processes, miss because they don't think that way. So I think this is a very neat talk on understanding the value of difference in learning, in perception and thinking, and also recognizing that we need to make some changes in the way that we teach from a very early age, the way that we engage with children perhaps who have been identified as being on the autism spectrum, and how we can enrich their lives and therefore create a more diverse world, and also valuing difference, I think, is kind of a neat takeaway. And she's very practical in her talk, and very much puts it out there, I think, in a way that a lot of people, even if you're not on the spectrum, can relate to, that we all bring something unique to the table, and that we need to create space at the table for those ideas and perspectives to be heard. So the next form of self-care and coping for me, similar to TED Talks, are podcasts. During this time of pandemic and quarantine, I've had more time to dig into podcasts, probably for a couple of reasons, just the shift to working remotely, being at home more as opposed to in the office, but also knowing that these podcasts serve a function for me, that they give me more information, that they help me calm down. So you'll see all of these podcasts have one thing in common. They're all led by Brene Brown, and you can find these talks and so many more on her webpage, brenebrown.com. These are part of the Unlocking Us podcast series. But these are just a handful of the ones that I've found personally meaningful and helpful. And what's kind of unique is that her podcast series started right around the time of the pandemic hitting the US, mid to late March. So I think these also have a unique perspective as they address certain issues that she probably would have talked about before, but now have a unique lens in terms of pandemic and quarantine and social isolation. So the first one is between Brene Brown and Dr. Harriet Lerner. Dr. Lerner researches a lot about relationships and communication. And what I really like about this podcast, How to Apologize and Why It Matters, is it helped me understand the true function and meaning of an apology. I think a lot of times it's become socially acceptable to just say, I'm sorry for, so many things that either we didn't cause, or that it's a little bit hollow because it's become the go-to response for a lot of things. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, or I'm sorry you're having a bad day. I'm sorry that, you're struggling with something. But in this talk, Dr. Lerner really explains how we can get better at making apologies and recognizing how to do that in a way that we recognize the hurt or the pain that we've caused for someone without turning the apology into kind of self-gratification or doing something to ease, our discomfort with something we've said or done that's hurt somebody else. But it really keeps the person that we've wronged in the forefront. And it really talks about what an apology is and what it isn't. And then there's a really wonderful role play between Dr. Lerner and Brene Brown, where they kind of explore just the powerful nature of a genuine apology and how different it feels when we apologize with intention versus apologizing as kind of social habit or reflex. The next one is with Brene Brown and Dr. David Kessler. He's a grief researcher who worked with the late Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, probably best known for her 5 stages of grief. And what I love about this podcast, especially because it came out during the pandemic when we were feeling collectively multiple losses and different layers of grief based on our individual experience. Lots of people were dealing with loss of job, loss of close family members and friends as a result of COVID-19, loss of identity when things shifted so much online, people's jobs changed, the learning environment for students changed, and there was a real loss of social connection as well as identity. And so I love the way that this talk explores grief and loss in a way that I think goes beyond the death of a loved one, and then extends that discussion into how do we find meaning in our lives post-loss. And not that we search for meaning in the loss, in the grief, but how moving forward we still create meaning and purpose in our lives. I think that's a really key distinction that often gets missed when we talk about grief and loss more broadly. The next one, a podcast with Dr. Mark Brackett. You'll hear about him a little bit later in this presentation, but in this podcast, he talks with Brene about his new book, Permission to Feel, and the social and personal importance of strengthening our emotional intelligence or our emotional IQ. Because culturally speaking, in the US, we just don't do a good job of teaching our children and therefore our adults to recognize and understand their own emotions, and then to communicate those emotions and express them in healthy ways. And in this book, Dr. Brackett shares a little bit about some of his experiences growing up, particularly the time that he endured a pretty abusive situation, and how different his experiences could have been if he and his caregivers, his parents, had been better at understanding and recognizing emotion in each other and then talking about that. And it goes on to explore the idea of, in our culture's busy, moving on from one thing to the next life, when we ask people, how are you feeling or how are you doing? We expect to hear fine, okay, busy, tired, but we don't expect that person to kind of be honest and share what they're feeling and what's going on for them. And I think when people do that, it's a bit of a shock, not just for them, but for those around them, because it goes against the grain, and we haven't done well at preparing people to talk about their emotions and develop a language of emotion. So I thought this was a really great podcast, and that hits home in a lot of ways. The next one explores loneliness and connection. And as I talked about in the TED Talks that Brene Brown does, we are dealing with a pervasive sense of loneliness and disconnection and lack of belonging in this country. And I see it with students I work with, not just here, but at other college campuses that I've worked at. We're constantly hearing that students aren't truly connecting. They're not feeling like they belong, and therefore the thoughts that kind of race through their minds are, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy enough, I'm not lovable. And I think the pandemic put a lot of that into perspective in terms of mental health and how lonely and disconnected many of us felt before the pandemic hit, but then how that was exacerbated by quarantine, social isolation, being away from friends and family out of safety, of course, but understanding that comes with a flip side, or it comes with a cost. So I really find value in that. And then the last two podcasts with Laverne Cox and Ibram X. Kendi, these are wonderfully powerful podcasts around representation of identity and challenging institutionalized and systemic oppression, challenging racism, thinking about how our identities are really intersectional, especially when it comes to oppressed identities. And both of these are a little bit longer. These are both about an hour, but they're so worth listening all the way through, because they touch on so many issues that we as a country are struggling with right now, on a broader level, but on an individual level as well. When we look at identity, when we look at who gets represented, whose rights, whose humanity gets represented in laws and in media and film, and how we think about how we treat people and where that comes from. So I find both of these incredibly powerful, and I really think they're worth the extra time to sit and listen and reflect, and challenge maybe some belief systems that we've all kind of grown up with, particularly in the talk about how to be an anti-racist, thinking about what we may unconsciously do on a day-to-day basis that could be considered racist, or pursuing a racist policy, and how we can actively take part in changing that. Again, two wonderful talks, very powerful, and I certainly hope if you decide to listen to any of these, that you do so with an ear of self-compassion as well. So this next slide really talks about my love of reading, and reading for me from an early age. I was the kid who late at night would be under the covers with a flashlight and a book, staying up way past bedtime, because I loved to read, and I loved understanding things. And so for me, coping and self-care starts in a lot of ways with reading. And on this slide, I just picked a couple of books that I've either read and reread multiple times, or in the case of this last one, a new book that I think I'm going to be reading and rereading for years to come, because they share knowledge, they share a perspective for me that I either didn't necessarily have, or it was a gap in my understanding, where it resonated so strongly with me that it serves as a continual reminder that I need to grow and work on some of these areas. So the first one, again, coming back to Brene Brown, it's the underlying theme in my form of self-care, is her book, The Gifts of Imperfection. And this is a book that spoke to me during my graduate studies, because I strongly identified then, and maybe to a lesser degree now, as a perfectionist. I would say now I'm a recovering perfectionist. It's a process that takes time. But this book really outlined her research that led to the 10 guideposts of wholehearted living. That's the major takeaway here. And they're very concrete steps for how we can create authenticity and vulnerability and rest and play. And the way that we cultivate those is by learning to let go of maladaptive or harmful ways of thinking or being, perfectionism being one of them, but also this idea of exhaustion as a status symbol, caring so deeply about what other people think of us that the things that we do and pursue are externally motivated for approval rather than for things that make us happy or that we're interested in. And my favorite quote from that, as you'll see, is, "Here's what is truly at the heart of wholeheartedness. Worthy now, not if, not when. We're worthy of love and belonging now, right this minute as is." And I think that's so powerful that we really recognize and validate that as a human being, you are worthy of love, you're worthy of connection, that there's nothing that you need to prove to yourself or to anyone to be deserving of that. You're worthy of it as is. And I think I definitely see a lack of that in my work with students, but also in broader social relationships. I'll be worthy when I do this, or it's a conditional response. So I've read and reread that book multiple times and really enjoy it. The next is The Gift of Therapy by Dr. Irvin Yalom. And I think this is one of those essential books for anyone thinking about going into a helping profession, particularly the mental health profession. It was given to me as a gift when I graduated from my master's program. And essentially what it is it's an exploration really on what it means to be a therapist. And Irvin Yalom, he's a formidable force in psychiatry and psychology. He does a lot of existential and humanistic work, but he also does a lot of group work as well. And so he's written the textbook literally on group therapy, but he's also written so many other books for clinicians and the general public at large. So I encourage people to kind of check out his writing. But what I love about this book, and it kind of comes out in the quote, is that, look out the other's window, trying to see the world as your patient sees it. And I think, any clinician who feels very passionate about their work, who sees it as a calling in a lot of ways, we strive for this. We strive to understand the perspective of the people that we work with. And I think for clinicians and the general population, the more that we can try to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, to develop our sense of empathy, the better relationship we're going to build with them, no matter what kind of relationship that is. But also, the stronger our connections and sense of belonging really are going to be. And it makes the work that we do so much more meaningful. So I love this book. I think it's one that I turn to a lot in my early days as a clinician, but I still come back to after a few years and reread again to get something new or a different perspective on his work. And then the last one we've kind of talked about already, Dr. Mark Brackett's book, Permission to Feel, Unlocking the Power of Emotions to Help Our Kids, Ourselves, and Our Society Thrive. So as we talked about, this really helps us understand the importance and value of emotional intelligence and developing language for emotion, so that we can recognize it in ourselves, we can recognize it in others, and we can change the nature of relationships that we have. I love how in the TED Talk he does with Brene Brown, but also in the book, he addresses this idea of what could parent-child relationships be if, parents didn't feel like they had to be so busy and on the go, and that when they asked their kid in the morning, how are you feeling today, if their children had the ability and the courage in a lot of ways to share what they were actually thinking and feeling in that moment, to then get a response from parents to be there with them and help them explore and understand their emotion, rather than saying, we're running late, we'll talk about it later. I think it's fundamental into changing the way that we understand ourselves, but also understand and relate to others. And that trickles down into so many life areas that could be improved if we were more equipped to know our emotions, to lean into them, and then to share them and communicate them in a healthy way to others. And this is the quote that very much resonated with me when I was watching the TED Talk by Sue Klebold, is but loving me was not synonymous with seeing me. And in her TED Talk, Sue addresses loving her son was not enough to combat his mental health struggles and to ultimately prevent him from, the violence towards himself and others that resulted in mass tragedy. And here, Dr. Brackett is speaking specifically about his experience of abuse, that he knew his parents loved him, but their love did not equate to recognizing his emotion, his pain, his suffering, and being able to intervene. So I think for me, this is going to be one of those books that's probably in constant rotation throughout my career. This next slide gets to explore the more whimsical side of my love of books and reading. You'll see just a smattering of titles and series that some I've read and reread multiple times. Jane Eyre, The Great Gatsby, those are my two favorite classics. Each time I read them, I take away something new and can read them over and over and still not feel like I fully get everything in there. But you'll also see some more fun and fantasy type series. I think it's nice to get away, I think, through reading, get to live the life of different characters and live in different worlds, or engage that creative part of fantasy in our minds a little bit. So those are fun series, the Wicked series, Harry Potter, Dresden Files, things like that. You know, those are certainly not clinical or work related in any way, but they're just fun reading for me. And then other books, autobiographies, historical fantasy. If you want a good cry, A Dog's Purpose, I think from the moment I started listening to that, I do a lot of audiobooks. From the moment I began that one, I think I was crying throughout the whole thing, but it was a good cry as a dog lover. So that is my warning on that one. Fantastic book, but certainly hits on all the emotions. So I think reading for me serves multiple functions, gaining knowledge and understanding, exploring concepts, but also a little bit of that fun escape from some of the heavy things that we deal with day to day. I also really enjoy being physically active. As a kid, you know, I played a lot of sports. That sort of dropped off in high school, but during my doc program, I discovered long distance cycling, long distance running, multi-sports such as triathlons. And I think that became a way for me to be healthy on multiple levels, especially during a very stressful program and process. So in this picture, that's post-finish from a charity ride that I like to do that raises money and awareness for pancreatic cancer and melanoma research. But it's a long distance ride where it's just me out on a trail that I know very well. There's other people that, you know, of course you're going to meet along the way, but as you find your own pace, you know, for me, it becomes very much an individualized sport, if you will, because it's me a bit lost in my thoughts, processing things, but also being out in nature. There's nothing more relaxing, I think, for me than being on my bike on a trail. Pennsylvania is really good for rail trails. So that's one of the ways that I stay active. I got into long distance running. Half marathons became kind of my distance for a while. I did, you know, challenge myself to do the full marathon, which I did twice. And that was enough for me to know that, yes, I could do it. I could mentally and physically complete that challenge, but probably not one that my body wants me to do much more of in the future. But again, running long distance in particular became my self-care, a time to reflect, a time to just be in my zone, whether I was running with music or just listening to nature. Much prefer running outside as opposed to being on a treadmill and going nowhere. But sometimes you gotta be a little bit flexible and keep time constraints in mind too. But that's just another way that I take care of myself, and hope to get back into more long distance running again soon. And lastly, just a nod to the important role that my dogs and cat play in my life as supports of stress relievers. Sometimes it's the cause of my stress and worry, but you know, when you see those faces, whether the kennel is dressing up my dogs or they're in their happy place out in nature in the sun, kind of in their own space, you know, they really bring a lot of joy and love into my life. And then of course, Daisy there on the end in her tunnel, you know, she is much different than the dogs. She and I have a different relationship. There are some days when she's snuggly, and other days where, you know, she wants her own space. So it's a really good lesson in boundary setting. But you know, they they play a very important role for me and my partner in enriching our lives, but also when you just need that moment to be quiet. Maybe we're on the couch watching TV or snuggling in the morning before work. You know, they certainly help me calm down a lot of the time, even if they do cause me some worry here and there. So I really want to thank everyone for you know, sharing this presentation, going with me on my journey to talk about self-care and healthy coping. Maybe some of this will resonate for you as you all think about what are your best ways of staying connected, reaching out for help, and taking care of yourselves physically, emotionally, relationally during this semester. But as we move forward into the coming semesters, they will each have their own unique challenges and will require us even more to rely on some of those self-care skills that will help get us through those times. So thank you all again. I hope everyone had a great fall pause, or at least a relaxing fall pause. And remember to take care of yourself, not just because it's Mental Health Awareness Week, but because you're worthy of that care. Thanks.